And there I go. I'm adding permanent rose. We're all going to be working with just permanent rose, working wet on dry, and I'm just filling that shape in and cleaning my edge and painting the side also. So I want to make that a natural um, uh, edge. Now again, working wet on dry, and I'm filling from the well, and I want to keep that nice and wet and continuing on, filling in those little spaces, and then just once it's wet, adding a little bit more color and going to the next shape and working wet on dry, adding the color and dropping in more as necessary as you see it. And we're just working little areas, so we don't have to be tilting so much to make everything move because they're tiny little shapes. But just keep adding color as you see it. Okay, so now I'm getting that big petal all wet. I'm not worried about the edges right now, but I want to drop in my color, and I'm letting it move in the water. You can see where I'm using creamier and then a heavier, and I'm letting it move. If it wasn't moving enough, I added some water, and now that it moved, I'm using gravity to move the color, and I'm dropping more in, and I'm going to start cleaning up my edges. Oh, I'm putting that color under the rim of that lip and letting it spread, and then I'm going to start cleaning up the edges. And I'm using a little brush. Whoops, and I guess I already did. So now I'm moving and adding more color, and I excuse my bald head, and I'm adding some color and softening that out, and got it wet. If you get a drop, just use a damp brush and soften that out. And I'm working that big petal there, and I'm also working the shadow under it, so that I don't have a big heavy line there. And I'm working with a creamier amount of color this time and making sure it gets in the shadow and the edge of the petal. And I'm going to let that move around, and using some of the color from the well, soften out so it can spread, and I'll tilt it, let it soften, and there you can see it's, look at how that softened out and it's moving. Oh, I love it. And all the control is just in using the gravity. And see how it all softened out? Now I'm painting, finishing the edges, making sure, because that petal extends off, so I'm going ahead and working that edge and moving it around. And now I'm going to get ready, prepared, or actually I'm going to let it dry, and then I'm going to be starting on the next shape. But just looking at it and watching how it softens. Now I'm going to the next petal after the other one dried. See how it dried lighter? And I'm working the next petal shape, and again wetting the shadow underneath, cleaning up the edges with water. And I'm going to add some color, and I'll add it right where I needed it, and then of course working into that shadow shape, tilting it, there's my bald head again, and letting it spread. And if it wasn't spreading enough, see how I added some water, and I'm tilting it so the water goes back into the pigment, and then letting it spread back out again. And you notice I'm not painting a lot. Now I'll go ahead and do the side, because the side needed some color there. Now it doesn't go everywhere, but it just where it needs to be on that edge. Okay, now once that's dry, then I'm working from the well, picking up some color, and I'm wetting that whole big shape there. Gonna get the sides painted with that color. Now I can start putting my dark in the petal, and then also working into the shadow. So it's really important to work the shadow along with the petals. That way you don't get those double hard lines there. I'm carefully working the shadow. It's still wet, but I'm using a real creamy amount. Gonna tilt that canvas so that you don't see brush strokes. And I'm going to let that dry. Now I'll go and clean up the edges. And look at how vibrant that is while it's wet. I just love that color. Okay, now that it's dry, I'm working the mouth of the flower, getting it wet, and I'm going to be working right there. I need to see, I'm softening that edge there, and I'm working that petal shape, getting it wet, and I'm going to be putting some color in there. As you can see, I'm starting now, and I'm making it all nice and wet. I work that whole shape because I didn't want there to be a line of demarcation. Now see how fluid I am with that big brush, but it's so much nicer to use a smaller brush if you have to. But going in, adding some color, adding lines, gonna let it soften out with the water. Keep an eye on it, don't move too much too soon or it's gonna flow right off the page. Now I'm working the edge because that color extends over, and I'm watching how it's softening out, and I'm really happy with it, and dropping in a little bit more color because it all washed, it moved out too far. So I want there to be a little bit of, give it some depth. Now as it's drying, you'll see right now, well, maybe not, and here I am adding more color into that little lip area there, and I'm extending beyond into the shadow, and I'm really happy with that. Now I'm going to be working that one petal that we left alone, getting it wet, getting the shadow above wet also, which we already worked on, and see how I separated that shape. It's really key. It was penciled in, but we kind of ignored it. And so anyway, getting that shadow wet and the petal wet with color, heavy color, and it's all wet, and now I'm going to soften out once I get my edges secure. Let it soften out, and I'm going to let it dry. Now I can start working those little ribbony petals that we've kind of ignored for a long time. So getting them wet and dropping in light pink. So I'm not using it too creamy, but I am getting it wet and loading some color in there. And I'm not filling in the whole thing. You can see how I leave gaps so that when the color spreads and softens, it's going to give us some texture. And I didn't get the edges wet, but now with a little brush I can pull all of that wet color to the edge. So it's more important to get the shape wet, load your color in just like I'm showing you there, leaving a lot of white gaps, and once you soften and move it around, then take that little brush and move that color to your edges and add it where you see it, look at your image and it'll tell you where you need to go. So all those nice little ribbony areas are taken care of now. And now once that's dry, you go to the next shape, and this is that hard petal shape. So getting it all wet in there because I want it to all soften. I don't want it to be all, different shapes. And starting to get it wet in there in the corner. You saw that water move out. Now go ahead and start adding your color in. Going to soften out and then get ready to let it spread. And see how that we had that hard edge there because I didn't get it too wet there. And I'm adding more color in, going to let it all soften out. And we work separate petals, and now we're kind of doing, what do you call a unifying glaze. So it's still, the petals are still separate, but they're a little bit more unified. Now I'm going in carefully and cleaning up those edges and adding color as needed. And now this is where I'm watching. It's such a big area, I have to be careful about the color. Right there where you just saw me wet, it's all still wet, but right there it was starting to dry, so I added a little bit of water and color. So it's not going to create a blossom because everything else was still wet, but right there it was a dry spot and I didn't like how it was ending. So now I'm going to work the under part of the shadow, and because I haven't really put color in there yet. So, oh no, I'm working that one petal again because it wasn't deep enough. So I'm going to add some more color to it. And before we added it into the shadow, and still going into that shadow. And of course, this is all done once those areas are dry, and I'm just dropping in more color because it was a lot of color, but as it dried, it was too light. I needed to add more color. That's what I'm doing. So, gonna have to tilt it and working the edge, and now I can tilt and let it soften out, and it's a little bit more intense now, so I'm going to be happier with that. And adding more in, because we want to be sure that we don't have to go back in again. Anyway, that's how I roll, and I'm really liking it. Now that it's dry, I'm going to work that shadow shape that we've kind of ignored, and to me it looks like a little seal pup. And let's work over to the other shadow. So we're connecting those three shadows together. You just saw me get those shapes wet. Now you're going to see me painting the whole shape. See how that works? So we're connecting again with a high amount of color. I'm going to let that tilt, spread, and add more and clean up the edges. And I'm really happy with that. And don't worry, it looks really intense now, but we're going to get that even darker, but we're going to get it dark with a different color. So now working that outer petal, and because we lost some of the reds there, so just cleaning it up, and it's too yellow there. So I'm going to add some color. There's my bald head again. And getting it all wet, perfect and nice. Letting it get wet on the edges so I can extend color down. And now see how I'm painting that thick amount of color? And because I want it to hang there, I don't want it to leave or dissipate in all of the water. So I was being real creamy. Now I can let it move because it was really, really wet. Let it move. And look at how that just softens out. It's so beautiful. I love it. And that's what I love about the stretched, because you just get to play and use gravity versus using a lot of brushwork to paint. And that's the fun of it. That's the challenge of it. And adding more color because it started running and dissipating. And now I'll work those edges. And all of that color drip